Welcome back everyone to the final section of the videos based on industry-related manufacturing technology. So we will talk about the industry study in further videos, but for the moment I think this will be the final video of actual multimedia-centric content. When we talk about the industry study later, we will be talking about it from a multimedia context, but we won't be doing any videos on the major project and on the portfolio, at least at this moment, because I've written the textbook for you that shows you how to write a Band-6 portfolio, and that will be available online, and I've also handed it out to you if you are at my school where I'm teaching at. So what we're going to do is we're going to move on to page 40. Well, we finished 46 and we've talked about the major project. We're going to, specifically, we don't need to talk about that because it's just looking at software that's relevant to the major project. Now, we go through that in class, and also in my portfolio guide I give you examples of what you might need to do for that, but it also is really dependent on your choice of major project. So it's pointless for me to go and say every single idea, because you might be making a game, you might be making a video, you might be making an animation, and there's no point if you're making a live action film for me to talk about the different ways to use Unity and whether Unity is better than Unreal Engine depending on what kind of game you're creating, alright? It's just a waste of time. So we're going to move on to page 47 of the 2008 syllabus. This may be a short episode, it may be quite a long episode. You'll notice that there's WHS there, so workplace health and safety. I'm not going to talk about this video because we go over it again in the industry study in much more detail. So we'll talk about workplace health and safety there. There's no point in going over it twice. What I will talk about though is intellectual property right and ethics, and we're going to look at that from a 2019 perspective for Australia only. So one of the biggest pitfalls that students have here is that they put American law into whenever they're talking about copyrights and multimedia. They don't understand that the laws in Australia are often quite different to the laws that people have in America, and all online discussion about copyright usually takes American laws into account. One of the first things we need to get away with is fair use is not a thing in Australia. So every time somebody pirates something on the internet, they're like, I did it with fair use. Now, fair use, what does that mean? It can mean any number of things based on whoever you talk to. But the idea is that you should be allowed to put up the things that other people's copyright is because it's fair. Anyway, no fair use in Australia. Don't use the term fair use when you're talking about copyright in Australia. Okay. So, if we are talking about copyright in the internet, the first thing to know is that it develops faster than we can govern the laws for it, okay? So new laws that apply to the internet get put in place, and by the time that they are up, things have already moved on. By the time we change them, things have moved on again, or there's a little loophole that people can get around. So there's a common myth that anything up on the internet is free, and it's not free. It has the same potential for litigation and as anything in a bookstore. Basically, as far as the law is concerned, stealing information from an academic journal is exactly the same as stealing a book from a bookstore. Also, there's a myth that you need to actually go about and do something to copyright your work, and if somebody hasn't copyrighted their work, it's up for grabs. So in Australia, that's not true. Any creator automatically has copyright over their work, as long as it satisfies the basic ideas. So it needs to be their work first off. So basically, if you copy, publish, or perform, so display it in public, you revise, so you change it, but not in any real way, you make a derivative form of it, then you're disobeying copyright law, basically. And the thing is, you own a copyright when you create something, unless you sell that copyright to someone else. So a good example of that is a musician under a record label. So let's say I'm a musician and I create a piece of work. totally original. Okay, I record it, but I was paid by a record company to do it. Chances are the record company now owns the copyright to my work. Now that's fine because I sold that copyright, but they are now the legal owners of that piece of content. I may have some say in what's done with that piece of content, but legally the record company owns that piece of content and can do what they wish with it. So if they want to put it into some compilation or put it onto a TV show, if they own the total copyright to it, I don't really have a say in it. I'm just the writer of it. Now, if I retain the copyright to that song, I have full control over it. But I can sell off my copyright, and that's very important to understand. That was an HSC question, I'm pretty sure, in the past. So, if you download something off the net, it's the equivalent to making a copy of that content. It's the same as photographing a book in a library. So, in America, we have fair use, the term, and that says that you can use it for some projects, but it's difficult to explain and it's not going to hold up in Australia anyway. So we can talk about education. So in education in Australia, if you're teaching for a class, you can apply for fair use in America, or I'm pretty sure you can do about 10% of a book in Australia. So you can photocopy 10% of a book, any more than doing 10% of a book, and you're liable to copyright infringement. You need to get the same permission off the World Wide Web, okay? So the idea is that you really just need to get permission. So you can use other people's stuff. It's not always copyright infringement, and that's another big thing that you need to realize. It's only copyright infringement if you don't get permission from the copyright owner. So if you ask a musician to be able to use their work in your video, they're only allowed to give you permission if they own the copyright to their music. Otherwise, you need to get permission from the copyright owner, the record label. Now, the record label can say, yes, you can use it, or yes, you can use it for a price, or no, you can't use it. If you choose to use it and don't remunerate them in some way, that's copyright fraud. If you use it when they said no, that's copyright fraud. But if you get permission to use it, then that's totally allowed. And that's the way that Australian copyright law works. You can steal other people's stuff as long as you have permission to steal it from the copyright owner. That's a big thing that people need to understand. So, the most obvious copyright infringement activity that we currently have is sharing music, movies, and software. So we've got P2P, peer-to-peer networks, and sharing of files, thousands of lawsuits all over the world with that. And you can get sued by the copyright holders. I think it's like $50,000 per offense, and that's $50,000 per song that can be charged if it goes to court and you get passed through with that. It's not something you want to do if you can help it, especially now that everything's available streaming anyway. So with the start of streaming software, we've kind of seen an end to the pirating of music software, largely anyway. If you've got something like Spotify when you can listen to it for free anyway, and it's completely legal, there aren't a lot of people that are willing to commit copyright fraud and potentially go to jail just to have something downloaded on a device. So we're seeing that. Then we can move on, and we're talking about copyright and multimedia. So now we move on to talk about ethical use, okay? So ethics is very difficult with the internet because we're talking about global law, and law is different in different countries. So what might be totally fine in Australia might be illegal in another country. So for example, the drinking age in Australia is 18. The drinking age in America is 21. I can totally go into a bar at 19 in Australia and drink whatever alcohol I want within reason. Can't go into America and do the same without a fake ID, even though it's legal in my place of residence. So you need to understand when we've got a global community that things that are legal in Australia may not be legal in America or China and vice versa. So a great example of that is the Chinese internet is rife with censorship. So they don't allow Facebook, they don't allow a lot of social media actually. I'm not even sure if they have Google. They might have a variant of Google. It's a Chinese version of Google. I know if you look up, at least a couple of years ago, if you looked up the Tiananmen Square massacre in China, it would just show you pictures of Tiananmen Square, not the actual tank with the famous photo with the person on there. It was just censored entirely. But it's not just China that has massive internet censorship. Large parts of South America and Africa have it. Canada's got a little bit of internet censorship. Australia's got pretty substantial internet censorship. America doesn't have much. You can pretty much look at whatever you want in America. Russia has zero censorship. And is that good or not? It's debatable. I mean, we can say that it's bad that China doesn't tell the truth to its citizens, but how do we know the same's not happening to us in Australia? You know, it's weird. And let's bring it back the other way as well. So some things that are illegal in Australia may not be illegal in other countries, and let's bring that back to video games. So the main thing that comes up with Australian law and censorships has to do with the way that we censor video games a lot more strongly than other Western countries. So for whatever reason, violent video games tend to get banned in Australia much more readily than they do in America, Canada, Britain, any of the other Western European countries. If there's gratuitous violence, if there's drug taking, if there's, well, anything that teenagers should not be privy to in a video game, instead of being rated, you know, like R and restricted to adults, often the games are just refused classification, meaning they can't be sold in the country. That's a decision made by the Classification Board of Australia, and up until a few years ago there wasn't even an R rating, so even more games used to be banned in Australia. Now, why is this? It's because the people in charge have decided that those things are illegal in Australia. That's the way it is. Now, rightly or wrongly, that's the way it is. So if you buy an Australian version of a game, it may be censored. So I remember the South Park games, Stick of Truth was notorious for this. So there was a particular scene that was refused classification by the board. So the South Park creators decided to replace that scene with a image of a crying koala with an Australian flag behind it. And then the game passed censorship and was allowed to be sold in Australia. Now, we always talk about censorship of other countries being pretty pervasive, but you need to understand that sort of thing is happening in Australia as well. So there's lots of censorship. So let's talk about cookies as well. So cookies are a part of a website that tracks you and tracks your data. So when you go onto it, it's a little piece of text, a little piece of code that's stored on our hard disk. So it allows a website to store information on your machine and later on retrieve it. So a website will know what you had, let's say, in your shopping cart when you were there last time, and it'll be there when you come back. It can also be used to shift advertisements towards you. So we can, you may have noticed if you've ever been on a website, you suddenly start getting ads related to that website. So if you go on Amazon, you'll look up Amazon, you'll be on another web page later and it'll have great Amazon deals on there. And so it solves a big problem that we had with websites before, because it lets website owners know that you've visited the site beforehand. And so we can track preferences, we can track what's working. From that, we can track what people click most often, and we can move our stuff towards it. Some people don't like cookies because they see them as tracking, but at the end of the day, it's not really being used maliciously, except it's being used to try and sell you stuff, so I guess that could be considered malicious. I don't know. It is what it is. Recently, I think in the EU, they've placed a law that you need to tell people when they're being tracked through cookies, so you'll see a lot of those annoying pop-ups when you come onto some sites now and say, you're being tracked by cookies. If you don't have a problem with it, click OK and it'll go away, and then they'll continue to track you with it. But I mean, everything's tracking you anyway. And ethically, is that correct or not? Who knows? I mean, if you have a Facebook account, you're most definitely being tracked, and all of your Content and everything you write there is owned by Facebook. Gmail has said in the past that it definitely reads through your emails. Everything is being tracked, basically. So you can worry about it or you can not worry about it. But, you know, the benefits that we get from the internet pretty much outweigh the negatives from all of this tracking. And you kind of have to use the internet at this point. You can't really function in society. So I guess it's just the way that society is going. So let's talk a little bit just about Australia and copyright again, just to really define it seriously so you can understand. So copyright exists pretty strongly in Australia, doesn't exist pretty strongly in China. So China can create fakes of things without anything really worried about it. In some countries you have to register for copyright, so when you create something you have to like fill in some forms and stuff, but in Australia you have automatic copyright. So the scope of copyright in Australia goes back to the Australian Copyright Act of 1968, which has been amended, and so designs can be copied, so that's a sculpture or a drawing, and through that we can count a video as well by the Design Act. And then since 2007, performers have moral rights in recordings of their work. So what that means is if you record something in Australia, even if you're not the copyright holder, you can have a moral right. So you can have some rights to the way that it's used, which is a very good thing. So up until 2004, copyright used to be till the person died plus 50 years. So if these videos, I would have the copyright to them if I died tomorrow for the next 50 years. And then anybody could use it. In 2004, that was changed to plus 70 in line with the USA and the European Union. But it was not made retroactively. So a lot of the reason for that was stuff like Disney and all of those big copyrights that were made in the past 50 years were about to run out. And they really wanted to keep the rights to, let's say, like Mickey Mouse, right? Because if we could start using Mickey Mouse for free, then they no longer have a copyright to that character and anybody can use them. Because Walt Disney owned the copyright to it, he died 50 years before. All of a sudden, Mickey Mouse is like Sherlock Holmes and any creator can use him without having to pay anyone for the copyright. So my thoughts is they're going to continue copyright out and it's going to continue to go longer and longer and longer. But that's just me, okay? So copyright is mentioned in the Australian Constitution. So the Copyright Amendment Act of 2006 made changes because of the US-Australian Free Trade Agreement. So it strengthened anti-circumvention laws. So it kind of made it harder to get around copyright laws than it was before. So it's closely modeled on the US Digital Millennium Copyright Act because the Copyright Act needed to be amended to deal with digital technology. So the old Copyright Act was written in a place where the internet didn't really exist as a thing. I mean, it's from 1968. It was amended still, but we started it in sort of 06. So the Act introduced a whole bunch of new things. So the best known are private copying exceptions. So Attorney General at the time, Philip Ruddock, he said that we need to make it so you can tape TV, okay? So with a VCR tape, this is like the most up-to-date piece of legislation we have, okay? So it's ridiculous. So we wanted to be able to record TV and radio to watch at a later date. Now, some people were saying that's copyright fraud, okay? So let's say, I don't know, Mary Poppins comes on TV. I should be allowed to tape that so I can watch it at a later date. I don't have to sit in front of it, okay? So we wanted to do that as well, and also format shifting music. So we can take CDs and copy them onto a portable computer, okay, onto an MP3 player. So beforehand, when that came out, people were trying to say, no, a CD has to stay as a CD and it can never become an MP3 file on an MP3 player, okay? So that was people trying to make more money out of new technology. But fortunately, we got it through. So format shifting and private use was already done. Okay, so it also introduced the idea of parody and satire, which is the closest thing in Australia that we have to fair use. So you are allowed to use copyright material to parody and satire it. So if you're making fun of something, you're allowed to use copyrighted material. So that's like parody songs, things of that nature. As well, there's an exception to allow certain non-commercial use by public sector institutions, like universities and schools. So the idea is that you can there's a little bit of wiggle room if you're doing something for educational purposes. Not heaps, but you might get away with it. All right, so you can do copyright infringement in Australia if it's a review. So you can include parts of a movie for a film review or a critique. You can include it for research or study. So you can include quotations of stuff without it being copyright infringement. In news reporting, so if you're reporting on something, you can't really be up for copyright infringement unless you blatantly copy an entire story. Parody or satire, and professional legal advice, okay? So that's covered, okay? There was also a thing called fair dealing, okay? So fair dealing and fair use are not the same thing, even though they sound exactly the same. Australia has fair dealing, it doesn't have fair use, okay? It's weird, all right? You just need to understand that fair dealing is the Australian version, and there are a bunch of specific circumstances where you can use fair dealing, education stuff mostly. If you're interested, you can look it up on the Australian copyright site, but I think you'll be disappointed in what you can actually use because it's all pretty mundane and it's all pretty crystal clear. There's really not a lot of wiggle room on it. Chances are, if something sounds good and useful, you're probably breaching copyright. All right. So you don't need to put a copyright notice in Australia, like a little C in a circle for something to gain copyright, but you are entitled to place a notice if you want to. It's useful if you publish the first date of the copyright, and basically, if you have a copyright claim against someone in Australia, so if you own a copyright and you sue someone, it's not your job as the copyright owner to prove that it is derivative. It's the purpose of the defendant to say why it's not. So a great example of that from the past couple of years is Man Down Under. I think it's by Men at Work. So somebody bought the rights to Kookaburra Sits on the Old Gum Tree, the old nursery rhyme, and they sued Men at Work, if it is Men at Work, saying that the song was derivative of the melody to the Kookaburra song. Now, did the person who sued did they write Kookaburra Sits on the Old Gum Tree? No, they did not. However, they bought the copyright, potentially for the express position of suing Men at Work. Now, in a court of law, Men at Work could not prove consistently that their song did not copy the nursery rhyme. So the judge awarded the case to the copyright owner of the nursery rhyme, who now gets a percentage of the royalties on that song. Copyright law in Australia is weird. The way that the things that you need to take away from it is you own it when you create it in Australia. You don't need to apply for it. There is some wiggle room in terms of educational use, but we don't have that sort of fair use idea where you can kind of use little parts of stuff in Australia like we do in America. We have fair dealing, but it's kind of a really watered down version of it. Okay? Basically, don't steal stuff off the internet. Don't load stuff to the internet that's not yours, and you should be fine. Right. Hope you enjoyed this series of videos. I know they went for a really long time, but this is, in essence, all of the theory that you need to do for this class. So whether you're viewing it as revision or whether you're viewing it as a first time going through the syllabus, I hope that you gain something of value from these. All right. Thanks for your time.